Hi, welcome to Dreamsical Designs by Danielle. In this video, I show you how to sew your very own short teddy coat. It has a notch collar with two lapels that I showed you how to draft in my other video. I show you step by step how to sew the coat from scratch. This includes the notch collar with the two lapels, outer coat pockets, facing, lining, inner zippered welt pockets, coat loop, and snap closures. I also give you tips on how to sew with Sherpa fabric if that's your fabric choice as well. The design does lend itself well to other heavyweight fabrics such as wool, cotton, or other blends. Let's get started. This is my Sherpa fabric. It has these fun embroidered cherries on it. You can use Sherpa fabric as well for your coat or any other heavyweight fabric such as wool, faux fur, cotton, or other blends. This is my lining fabric. It's cotton, and I love the white polka dots on the red background. This is my interfacing for the coat. I'm using non-fusible interfacing or sew-in interfacing. Fusible interfacing won't work with Sherpa fabric because there isn't a flat surface for it to adhere to. My sew-in interfacing is cotton fabric. What isn't shown on the video is the fusible interfacing that we will use for the welt pocket opening. You will need two invisible zippers of length 7 to 9 inches. You will also need sew-on snap buttons or snap fasteners, and I'm using 3 pairs. These are your cutout pattern pieces. You should have 10 pieces from your main coat fabric. 2 coat front facings, 2 coat front with lapel pieces, 2 coat collar pieces, 1 coat back facing, 1 coat back piece, and 2 coat sleeves. You should have 5 pieces from your interfacing, 2 coat front facings, 2 coat collar pieces, and 1 coat back facing. You should have 12 pieces from your lining fabric, 2 coat front linings, 1 coat back lining, 1 coat loop piece, 4 outer coat pocket pieces, 2 inner coat welt pocket pieces, and 2 sleeve linings. The sewing process is divided into 3 major stages. 1. Sewing the lining. 2. Sewing the main coat. And 3. Attaching the lining to the main coat. As a general rule, you should press all seams and hems right after they're sewn and trim down your seams to 1/4 inch. We will begin with sewing the coat lining pieces together. Let's start with the welt pockets. Take a small strip of fusible interfacing and attach that over the welt opening of both pockets. Once that's attached, follow your pattern to determine how to line up your welt pocket on your front lining pieces. Placing right sides together, pin around the welt opening. You can also add in extra pins or clips to prevent things from shifting under the machine. You're going to sew 2 horizontal lines at the top and bottom of the welt opening. On your sewing machine, make sure to line up the needle at the very end of the top welt line. Take it nice and slow when sewing a straight line, making sure to follow your markings. When you get to the other end of the top welt line, you may need to reduce your stitch length to ensure that your needle ends exactly at the marked end point. Remember to backstitch at the start and end. Repeat this process for the bottom welt line. This is what your sewn welt line should look like after you're done. Now we need to cut into the welt pocket opening. Fold the welt pocket opening in half like this and make a small incision in the center of that welt opening. Unfold the pocket and continue cutting down each side of the welt pocket opening until you get to about 0.25 inches from the end, at which point you will then cut into the corners of the welt pocket at the top and bottom, forming a triangle flap at each end. Make sure not to cut past your stitches or into your stitches. After you've made your incisions, it should look like this. Repeat this process for the other welt pocket. Next, we need to press the welt pocket at key locations and turn it inside out. Fold the welt pocket upwards and press this area flat. Fold the welt pocket down and press this area flat. Turn the welt pocket inside out. This may take some finessing to get things to stay properly, then press the welt opening flat. Fold a portion of the bottom of the welt pocket up to cover the welt pocket opening. Press that flat. This is what your pressed welt pocket should look like. To hold the fabric around the welt pocket opening in place, you should sew across the 2 triangle flaps at the side and the seam at the bottom. You should try to sew as close as possible along the inside edge of the triangle flaps on both sides of the welt pocket opening and as close as possible to the edge of the seam at the bottom. These stitches will help hold things in place and prevent shifting during pocket usage. This is what the sewn triangle flaps and the bottom seam should look like after you're done. We're ready to attach the invisible zippers. Line up the zipper on the back side of the welt pocket opening. I chose to put my zipper pull on the inside portion of the welt pocket, but it doesn't matter which side it goes on. Just make sure that it is flush with one side of the welt opening. Also, make sure that the zipper teeth sit in the center of the welt opening. Once everything is aligned, pin the zipper in place from the right side of the fabric because this is the side that we're going to sew from. A hack to make this easier is to use double-sided fabric tape. I didn't have any readily available, so I stuck with pins, but it was a little tricky making sure things didn't slip around when placing the pins. Change your regular sewing foot to a zipper foot. This will allow you to get a closer stitch around the welt opening. Use a stitch length of 2.5 or even shorter to top stitch around the perimeter of the welt pocket opening. Be careful when sewing over the zipper teeth. You may need to pull on the other end of the fabric or use your sewing machine hand wheel to get the zipper foot to pass over the teeth. Also, you will need to maneuver the zipper pull out of the way as you're sewing. Take it nice and slow and you'll end up with a professional looking welt pocket. Repeat this process for the other welt pocket. When you're done sewing, this is what your top stitching should look like. After you've pressed the welt pocket opening flat, use pinking shears to trim both ends of the zipper such that the zipper length is contained within the seam allowances of the pocket. You can now close up your pocket. Fold the pocket up, placing right sides together, and clip in place. Sew the 3 sides of the pocket closed, starting from one end of the fold line to the other. Be sure to maneuver the front lining out of the way so you don't accidentally stitch the pocket to the lining. To make it easier to attach your front lining to the back lining and the coat facings, you can sew in a basting stitch along the outer side seam and the bottom seam if your pocket extends to the bottom like mine does. And that was the last step for your welt pockets that are now complete. Moving on to the rest of the coat lining. On your back lining, create the 1-inch pleat in the center back at the top and bottom, lining up your notches from your pattern and clip in place. Place your front and back lining pieces right sides together and clip the shoulder and side seams in place. On your sewing machine, sew the shoulder seams, side seams, and center back pleats in place. Once complete, press the seams open and trim down the seam allowance. Moving on to the sleeves. Take your sleeve linings and fold them lengthwise, right sides together to line up the side seams, then clip in place. Sew a straight stitch down the side seams of the sleeve linings. Once complete, press the seams open and trim down the seam allowance. To prep the sleeve armholes for sewing, place 2 rows of basting stitches of length 5 in between the armhole notches on both sleeves and within the seam allowance. When you get to the second row of basting stitches, increase your tension to a 6 or higher to auto-gather the fabric. Place the sleeve lining armhole and coat lining armhole right sides together, lining up the side seam, shoulder seams, and notches. You will need to finesse the gathered fabric to ensure even distribution, then clip in place. I like to hand sew a basting stitch to hold the armhole in place before sewing it. However, you're welcome to skip this step and move directly to sewing the armhole on the sewing machine. Sew around the circumference of the armhole on both sleeve linings. Once complete, you can remove your basting stitches, press the seam open, and trim down the seam allowance. Your coat lining is now complete. Before we move on to sewing the main coat, let's sew the coat loop. It will later be attached to the back facing. Take the coat loop and fold it in half lengthwise. Then fold the lengthwise ends of the loop to the inside of that fold line. Press it flat. After it's been pressed flat, top stitch a straight line from one end to the other as close to the edge as possible. Once complete, you can top stitch a few more straight lines along the body of the coat loop to give it more structure. This is what your completed coat loop should look like. The second major stage is to sew the main coat pieces together. We will start with the interfacing. Line up the interfacing pieces with their corresponding main fabric pieces and clip in place. Use a ballpoint needle and a walking foot to sew Sherpa fabric. The walking foot ensures that the fabric is fed through evenly on the top and bottom and helps to prevent the fabric from getting stuck since it has high friction. The walking foot is also great to use with stretchy fabric and is a good investment. To help line up your Sherpa fabric with the right seam allowance, I taped a colored ribbon along the seam allowance line of my machine. Take the interfacing pieces and sew a basting stitch within the seam allowance and around the perimeter of each piece to act as an underlining. Once complete, press the pieces flat. If you're working with Sherpa fabric, it's helpful to trim down the excess fabric that sits within the seam allowance to make it easier to see your seam lines when sewing later on. The first thing we'll sew on the main coat is the collar. Take the two collar pieces, place them right sides together, lining up the side and top of the collar, then clip in place. Refer to your pattern to determine where you should start and stop your sewing. It can be a little tricky to see this on Sherpa fabric. You can use a fabric marker to mark the seam lines on the interfacing of the collar. Sew from one side of the collar, across the top, then to the other side. I find it's helpful to use a flat object that can push the Sherpa fabric flat just before it goes under the walking foot to ensure the fabric moves smoothly under the foot and to minimize shifting. When sewing curves or sharp turns, lift up the walking foot, pivot, then place the walking foot back down. Once complete, trim down the seams, turn right side out, use a pointed object to push out the corners, then press the collar flat. To press Sherpa fabric, use a damp pressing cloth and low heat. Always test your iron on a scrap piece of fabric first. It's time to attach the outer coat pockets to the front coat pieces. Take two of your outer coat pockets and mark a 5-inch opening in between the top and bottom seam allowance. I started my opening half an inch below the top seam allowance. Next, place your outer coat pockets on the front main coat right sides together. Since it's hard to see notches on Sherpa fabric, I used a measuring tape to align my pieces according to my pattern. Clip them in place. At the top of the 5-inch line, sew a perpendicular line until you reach your marking. Pivot and sew straight down your 5-inch line until you reach the end. Pivot again and sew another perpendicular line until you've reached the edge of your fabric. This is what your stitching should look like after it's complete. It's basically a half rectangle. Fold the pocket over to expose the right side. Place it back under the sewing machine and top stitch a straight line along that same 5-inch area. Top stitch as close to the edge as possible. This is what your top stitching should look like after it's complete. To prep the pocket opening, clip into the inside corners of that half rectangle that you just sewed at a 45-degree angle. Clip as close as possible to the stitching without clipping the stitching itself. Flip the pocket over to the wrong side of the front coat piece to reveal that half rectangle opening, then press it flat. This will take some finessing to get the clip corners to lay properly as shown here. After everything has been pressed, place the remaining outer pocket pieces right sides together, then clip in place. Sew around the 3 sides of the outer pocket, leaving the opening side seam unstitched. Be sure to maneuver the main fabric out of the way to avoid accidentally attaching it to the outer pocket. Place the front and back coat pieces right sides together, then clip the shoulder and side seams in place. On your sewing machine, sew the shoulder seams and side seams in place. When you're sewing the side seams over the pocket opening, make sure to sew on the inside edge of the pocket opening, otherwise you'll end up sewing the pocket closed. You should be able to feel the edge with your finger. Once complete, press the seams open and trim down the seam allowance. This is what your completed outer coat pocket should look like. As you can see, this is our 5-inch opening that we marked and sewed around earlier. Take your coat loop that you sewed earlier and place it about 3 inches apart, straddling the center line evenly on the top of the back coat facing. Clip in place. Sew the coat loop in place within the seam allowance of the back coat facing. This is what your sewn coat loop should look like. Once complete, fold it into the typical shape of a coat loop, then press it in place. Next, place your back and front coat facings right sides together, then clip the shoulder seams in place. On your sewing machine, sew the shoulder seams in place. Once complete, press the seams open and trim down the seam allowance. We're ready to attach the collar to the coat bodice. Take the collar and place it right sides together with the neckline of the coat bodice. Make sure that the distance between the end of the collar and the end of the coat neckline is the same on both sides. This is because if you're using Sherpa fabric, it's difficult to see the notches to make sure things are aligned, so we need to use a different technique. If you're working with thick fabric like Sherpa, you will need to hand baste the collar to the coat neckline before sewing it on the machine. This ensures that nothing shifts around because you will be sewing 3 layers of Sherpa fabric, which is quite bulky. Sew the collar to the coat neckline, making sure to lift up your walking foot to pivot around the corners. Once complete, press the seams open, but do not trim the seam allowances down yet. We need to first attach the facings, then we'll be ready to trim the seam allowances. Place your facings and coat right sides together, lining up the neckline and down the sides of the lapel, then clip in place. Use the lapel corners and shoulder seams as your anchor points to align the pieces together. Same as with the collar, you will need to hand baste the facing to the coat before sewing it on the machine. This ensures that nothing shifts around because you will be sewing 4 layers of Sherpa fabric, which is even bulkier. Sew the facing to the coat on the machine. Since we're having to sew with 4 layers of Sherpa fabric at the neckline, it becomes very difficult for the machine to feed the fabric through smoothly. I recommend using lightweight tissue paper under the collar neckline to help the fabric move smoothly under the walking foot. You may also need to use one hand to pull the fabric taut on the other side to ensure the fabric feeds smoothly under the walking foot, or it may be enough to flatten the fabric just before going under the walking foot. Use whatever techniques works best for you and your fabric. Once complete, carefully remove the tissue paper from your stitching. Trim the seams down, turn the facings right side out, use a pointed object to push out the corners, then press everything flat. Moving on to the coat sleeves. Take your sleeves and fold them lengthwise, right sides together to line up the side seams, then clip in place. Sew a straight stitch down the side seams of the sleeves. Once complete, press the seams open and trim down the seam allowance. To prep the sleeve armholes for sewing, place 2 rows of basting stitches of length 5 in between the armhole notches on both sleeves and within the seam allowance. When you get to the second row of basting stitches, increase your tension to a 6 or higher to auto-gather the fabric. Place the sleeve armhole and coat armhole right sides together, lining up the side seam and shoulder seams. You will need to finesse the gathered fabric to ensure even distribution, then clip in place. If you're working with thick fabric like Sherpa, you will need to hand baste the armhole in place before sewing it on the machine. Sew around the circumference of the armhole on both sleeves. Once complete, you can remove your basting stitches, press the seams open, and trim down the seam allowance. Your main coat is now complete. The third and final major stage is to attach the lining and main coat pieces together. We start by attaching the lining and coat sleeves. To ensure we line these up correctly, temporarily place the lining inside the coat as how it would look as a finished product. Use a few clips to temporarily hold a small portion of the wrist lining and coat pieces together. I suggest clipping at and around the sleeve side seam. Next, carefully pull the coat and lining sleeves apart to look like this. Paying close attention to how you previously clipped the wrists together, remove the clips and reattach them, but this time with the right sides of the coat and lining fabrics together. Do this for the full wrist circumference of both sleeves. Once complete, it should look like this. Sew around the perimeter of the wrists on both sleeves. I find it easier to sew with the Sherpa fabric on the bottom and my cotton lining on top. Once complete, press the seams open and trim down the seam allowance. Turn the sleeves right sides out. You should have about 1 inch of Sherpa fabric folded under on the inside of the sleeve. After pressing the sleeve flat in this position, this is what the finished wrist should look like. Next, we need to attach the facing to the lining. With your coat in this position, basically how it would look as a finished product, lift up the bottom of the lining and flip it over the top. Take the lining neckline and line it up with the top of the coat facings, then clip in place. Also, line up the side of the lining with the sides of the coat facings and then clip in place. After everything has been clipped, right sides together, turn the coat right side out to check that the pieces were attached correctly. Flip them back inside out. Pull out the sleeves a little and place them under the neckline. This is done so that they don't get in your way when you sew a continuous stitch from one end to the other. Sew from one end of the front facing across the back facing to the other end of the front facing. I find it easier to sew with the Sherpa fabric on the bottom and my cotton lining on the top. Once complete, press the seams open and trim down the seam allowances. Turn the coat right sides out. And after pressing the lining and facing flat in this proper position, this is what the finished inner coat should look like. Now we need to attach the lining bottom to the coat bottom. With your coat in this position, basically how it will look as a finished product, lift up the bottom of the lining and flip it over to the top like this. We need to match the right side of the lining with the right side of the coat such that it contains the coat body on the inside like a bag. Match the side seams and ends of the lining and coat, then clip in place. Make sure to leave about a 4 to 5 inch opening for turning the coat right side out. When you get to the ends of the bottom pieces, you will need to unstitch the side seam that was previously sewn within the seam allowance to be able to properly attach the bottom pieces together. It was a little difficult to show on video with the Sherpa fabric, but you should be able to easily attach the bottom pieces at each end after you've done the seam ripping. Sew from one end of the bottom to the beginning of the opening. Then sew from the other end of the opening to the other end of the bottom. Since we unstitch a portion of the side seams, you'll want to reinforce that by placing a few stitches along the bottom side of both ends of the coat. Once complete, trim down the seam allowances on what you just sewed. Do not trim the seam allowances of the opening. Turn the coat right side out through the opening. Fold in the seam allowances of the opening and press those flat along with the rest of the coat bottom. You should have about 1 inch of Sherpa fabric folded under on the inside of the coat. We will need to use a hand-sewn invisible ladder stitch to close up the opening. To prep the opening for hand sewing, clip the opening in place by aligning the two folded seams together like this. Since I'm right-handed, I sew from right to left. To start the hand sewing, loop the needle through the lining, starting from the wrong side and exiting through the fold line. Take the needle and place it directly opposite to that thread line into the fold line of the coat fabric. Then, have that needle exit a short distance down that fold line, approximately 1/8 of an inch. Next, place the needle directly opposite to that thread line into the fold line of the lining fabric. Then, have the needle exit a short distance down that fold line, approximately 1/8 of an inch. Repeat this process for the entire opening until it's closed. When you get to the end of the opening, make a few loops around the inside seam. Before pushing the needle through the inside of the seam to the outside of the coat. Cut the thread and it should be hidden on the inside of your coat. The final step is to hand sew the snap buttons to your coat. You will need to use your measuring tape and a ruler to determine the location of your snap buttons on your coat based off of your pattern. I chose to have the left side of my coat be the outside flap, where the buttons sit 1 inch inwards, and the right side of my coat be the inside flap, where the buttons sit 3 inches inwards. I use pins to temporarily hold the buttons in place. And before hand sewing the buttons, check to make sure that they line up with each other. Use a double thread for your hand sewing needle. Start by placing your needle through a few stitches of the fabric that is hidden under the button, making sure not to sew all the way through to the other side, and then come up through one of the button openings. Now you're ready to start looping. Place the needle through a few stitches of fabric, making sure not to sew all the way through to the other side, and loop the needle up through one of the button openings. Repeat this process 3 to 4 times. Once you finish the looping for that button opening, insert your needle through a few stitches of the fabric under the next unsewn opening. Sew 3 to 4 loops using the same process as before. Once you finish sewing the last buttonhole, begin sewing a loop as normal, but before you complete it, thread the needle through to create a knot. Do this a couple of times, then thread the needle through a few stitches of fabric hidden under the button. Cut the thread and it should be hidden. This is what your completed hand sew button should look like. Repeat this whole process for the remaining buttons. This is your final coat with all the buttons in place. Do confirm that they line up. You can always unstitch and redo the hand sewing to adjust the location of the buttons. We need to do one final press of the 2 lapels so that they stay nicely in place when worn. After that's done, your coat is ready for cold weather. The short teddy coat is fun and practical. It has 4 pockets, 2 on the outside and 2 hidden ones on the inside, big enough for your phone and wallet. It's perfect for cool weather in the fall and winter. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you make your own short teddy coat, please tag me. I'd love to see how it turned out. Happy sewing!